The North Atlantic, 500 miles west of Ireland, March 17, 1943. The sea is a thing of liquid iron, a heaving, slate-gray mass that merges with a sky of the same color. There is no horizon. There is only the convoy, a scattered flock of 87 ships, wallowing in the troughs of the immense swells. They are the lifeblood. Slow, rust-streaked tankers carrying fuel from Texas, tramp steamers with holds full of Canadian wheat, munitions ships laden with the raw material of war. They are a city of steel, moving at the speed of the slowest vessel, a funeral procession crawling toward a war zone. And they are being watched. Somewhere beneath the waves, in the crushing, silent dark, the wolf is circling. Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Hunsaker, commander of U-527, presses his eye to the attack periscope. The view is a bouncing, distorted slit of gray, streaked with spray. But in it, he sees his prey. He sees the fat, lumbering shape of a C-2 freighter, its silhouette a perfect target. He is not alone. He is one of 13, a pack, a roodle, spread out in a long, invisible picket line, waiting. For 3 days, they have been shadowing convoy SC-122. They were not searching for it, they were sent to it. A message had arrived from U-Boat Command in Lorient, a burst of high-frequency code, giving them a time, a heading, and a speed. It was a rendezvous, an appointment with death, arranged from 1,000 miles away. The Allied system, the vast, lumbering machine of the convoy, is blind. On the bridge of the HMS Campanula, a Flower-class corvette pitching violently on the convoy's flank, the commander stares into the murk. The air smells of salt, diesel fumes, and wet wool. The only sound is the shriek of the wind through the rigging and the constant, rhythmic ping of the ASD set. Ping, ping, ping. It is the sound of a man tapping a cane in a blizzard. It can detect a submarine, but only if it is already close, already underwater. It cannot see the pack gathering on the surface, miles away, their low profiles lost in the clutter of the waves. The established Allied solution is a cage of warships around the sheep. But the cage is too small, and the ocean is too large. The wolf pack does not attack the cage. It waits for the sheep to wander. Hunsaker gives the order. A whisper of compressed air, and the first eel is away. A silver trail of bubbles, a thin, straight line drawn across the chaos of the sea. It is a sentence, delivered at 40 knots. Aboard the freighter, a lookout sees it. He has just enough time to scream, a sound snatched away by the wind. The torpedo strikes amidships, just below the waterline. The explosion is not a loud bang. It is a deep, concussive whump, a giant's fist punching through the steel hull from below. The ship seems to lift out of the water, its back broken, and then it begins to settle. The klaxons start to wail, a sound of mechanical panic. Then the second torpedo hits, and the third, from another direction, another U-boat, firing from the other side of the convoy. The night erupts. Star shells burst overhead, casting a cold, chemical glare over the scene. The freighters are now just black shapes silhouetted against rising towers of flame. The destroyers and corvettes turn, chasing ghosts. They drop depth charges, great plumes of white water that erupt from the sea, but they are firing into an empty room. By the time the explosions come, the U-boats are already gone, diving deep, their electric motors a faint hum against the chaos above. This is the impossible problem. The German U-boat command, the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, seems to possess a god's-eye view of the Atlantic. They know the convoy's routes, their speeds, their destinations. It is not luck. It is not masterful reconnaissance. The losses are too consistent, the attacks too perfectly coordinated. The official doctrine within the Admiralty is that there is a leak. A traitor of the highest level, buried deep within the Allied command structure, feeding the wolf pack. The convoy system, the very strategy designed to save Britain, is becoming an execution list, delivering ships to their designated assassins with chilling precision. This is not the story of admirals moving fleets on a map. It is not the story of the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, brilliant as they were. This is the story of a secret that was not hidden in a radio signal or a spy's briefcase. It was a secret hidden in plain sight, in the most domestic, most overlooked, most feminine of acts. This is the story of how one woman, living in occupied Belgium, used a simple ball of yarn and a pair of knitting needles to record the movements of the entire German war machine. It is the story of how her knitting became a code, a weapon that would find its way to London and, stitch by stitch, help sink the hunters who were bleeding Britain to death. To understand the knitting, you must first understand the wound. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a battle, it was the central, pulsating artery of the entire Allied war effort. Britain was a fortress under siege, an island nation that produced only half the food it consumed and none of the oil it needed to fuel its planes, tanks, and ships. Every bullet fired, every biscuit eaten, every gallon of petrol burned by a Spitfire had to cross the Atlantic first. If the artery was severed, the fortress would fall. This was the grand strategic problem. The German High Command, and Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat fleet, understood this with absolute clarity. They did not need to invade Britain, they only needed to starve it, to isolate it, to cut the lifeline and let the island wither and die. The U-boat was not just a submarine, it was a tool of strangulation. The established Allied solution was the convoy. It was a brutal piece of arithmetic. Grouping hundreds of merchant ships together, surrounding them with a thin screen of overworked escort vessels, and sailing them in vast, slow-moving herds. The theory was safety in numbers. The reality was a concentration of targets. In the first years of the war, the system had been moderately successful, but now it was failing on a scale that threatened to bring about total collapse. The period known to German submariners as the happy time had returned. In a single month, March of 1943, Dönitz's wolf packs would sink over 100 Allied ships, 500,000 tons of cargo sent to the cold, dark bottom of the ocean. The shipyards in Britain and America were working miracles, but they could not build ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. The arithmetic had turned against the Allies. For every 2 ships that left New York, only 1 was reaching Liverpool. The failure was not in the ships or the men. It was in the intelligence. The Allies were fighting an enemy they could not see, an enemy who knew their every move. The Admiralty's submarine tracking room, a basement nerve center in London, was a place of mounting despair. The men and women there worked around the clock, pushing small wooden ship models across a vast map of the Atlantic. Too often, they were simply moving the models from the convoy lanes to the grim tally boards on the wall that listed the sunk and the missing. They had Ultra, the priceless decrypts of the German Enigma machine, but the Kriegsmarine's version of Enigma, the 4-rotor Shark cipher, was a far harder target than the codes used by the German Army or Air Force. Bletchley Park was fighting its own desperate battle to break it, but for long, agonizing stretches, they were blind. Even when they could read the signals, the information was often hours or days old, too late to reroute a convoy already steaming into a U-boat's path. This is where the institutional arrogance took hold. In the absence of a clear signals intelligence picture, the Admiralty fell back on what it knew: espionage. They became convinced that the Germans had a source, a human asset, an Allied officer or civil servant with access to the convoy routing plans. The Royal Navy's counterintelligence branch, Section 17M, began a frantic, paranoid mole hunt. They investigated dock workers, they vetted naval staff, they placed surveillance on anyone with access to the sailing schedules. They were looking for a person, a spy in a trench coat, passing secrets in a waterfront pub. It was a problem they understood, a problem from the textbooks of the last war. They dismissed the alternative. A few voices, mainly from the scientific sections and the operational research teams, suggested the problem might be technological. They pointed to the uncanny ability of German reconnaissance planes, the long-range Focke-Wulf Condors, to find the convoys in the vast emptiness of the ocean. They wondered about advances in German radio direction finding. These theories were considered secondary. They were abstract, technical, and less compelling than the satisfying, cinematic drama of a high-level trader. The system was more comfortable with a human betrayal than a technological disadvantage. They were looking for Judas, not for a better mousetrap. The ticking clock was the build-up for the invasion of Europe. In the corridors of power in Washington and London, the plans were being drawn up for Operation Overlord, the grand, decisive stroke that would land Allied armies back on the continent. But an invasion force of that scale required a staggering amount of material. It required hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies, all of which had to be transported across the U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic. The losses of early 1943 were not just threatening Britain's survival, they were making the liberation of Europe a logistical impossibility. Every tanker that went down was a squadron of Sherman tanks that would not land on a beach. Every cargo ship lost was a regiment of soldiers who would not have the ammunition they needed. The entire Allied strategy rested on winning the Battle of the Atlantic, and winning it quickly. If the U-boat could not be defeated, there would be no second front, there would be no D-Day. The war could drag on for years, or be lost entirely. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on every man in the submarine tracking room. They were not just counting lost ships, they were counting the diminishing chances of ultimate victory. The system was failing because it was looking in the wrong place. The Admiralty's mole hunt was a frantic chase after a phantom. The secret to the U-boat's success was not in London. It was not even on the sea. The source of the intelligence, the fountainhead of the entire German campaign, was on the land. It was scattered all along the coastline of occupied Europe, in hundreds of seemingly innocuous locations. And the data it was gathering was not being passed by a spy. It was being collected by observers, measured by technicians, and woven, quite literally, into a tapestry of death. The established Allied solution was to find a traitor in their own house. It never occurred to them that the real spies were ordinary people, watching, listening, and counting from the windows of their own homes, and that the most dangerous agent of all was an old woman who simply liked to knit. The woman who would become the Admiralty's most unlikely weapon was named Adrienne Gex. She was not a spy. She was a 58-year-old widow who, before the war, had been the headmistress of a small primary school in the town of Reims, a quiet Belgian village nestled near the French border. She was a creature of routine and quiet dignity, a woman of straight-backed posture, of hair pulled into a severe gray bun, of hands that were never idle. She was known for her prize-winning roses, her unwavering Catholic faith, and the crisp, starched precision of her lace collars. She was, in every sense of the word, invisible. The German occupation forces who patrolled the town saw her as part of the architecture, a harmless, dour relic of a bygone era. They would see her sitting on the small bench in her front garden, her fingers a blur of motion with her knitting needles, and they would nod, sometimes even smile. She was the perfect picture of benign, conquered domesticity. This was her camouflage, an armor of perceived irrelevance. While the younger, hotter-headed men of the village were forming resistance cells, talking of dynamite and assassinations, Adrienne Gex was watching. Her house sat 50 yards from the main railway line, the steel artery that connected the industrial heart of Germany to the great U-boat pens on the French Atlantic coast, the concrete leviathans of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. And so she sat, and she watched, and she counted. Her eureka moment was not a flash of inspiration. It was the slow, methodical conclusion of a mind trained for 40 years to observe the patterns of children. She saw the war not as a series of battles, but as a problem of logistics. It was a vast, hungry machine that had to be fed. And the food for that machine rolled past her front gate every single day. At first, it was simple counting. 10 trains a day heading west, 8 heading east. But then the headmistress in her took over. She began to classify. She noted the difference between the closed boxcars of general supplies and the long flatbed wagons. She learned to recognize the silhouettes of the cargo under the tarpaulins, the unmistakable curved sections of a U-boat pressure hull, the long, menacing tubes of torpedoes in their transport cradles, the cylindrical tanker cars carrying diesel fuel. She began to keep a logbook, a child's school exercise book, filling its pages with her neat, disciplined script. She recorded times, dates, wagon types, and directions. She was part of a local resistance network, a small circuit of patriots who called themselves the Mark Group. They were brave, but they were amateurs. Their leader was the local butcher, a man of great courage but little subtlety. They gathered information, scraps of gossip about German troop movements, the location of an anti-aircraft battery. Their intelligence was passed by hand, on scraps of paper, through a long, slow chain of couriers that eventually, hopefully, reached London. Adrienne brought her logbook to one of their meetings, held in the cold back room of the butcher shop, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and raw meat. She laid out her findings, explaining with the patient clarity of a schoolteacher the patterns she had observed. She could, she explained, predict with reasonable accuracy when a new U-boat was nearing completion or when a damaged one was returning to service. The flow of specific components was as predictable as a tide. They listened politely. The butcher, a man who thought in terms of ambushes and sabotage, patted her on the hand. He told her it was good work, very detailed, but it was not what they needed. They needed to know the schedule of the Gestapo patrols. They needed to know which bridges were weekly guarded. Her train timetables were seen as interesting background information, but not actionable intelligence. It was too passive, too feminine. They wanted to fight the war with explosives. Adrienne was offering them a tapestry of data. Her meticulous work was dismissed, not with malice, but with the gentle condescension reserved for a well-meaning but slightly eccentric aunt. The system, even the underground system of the resistance, was built by men who understood the war in terms of direct physical conflict. Adrienne's logbook was put on a shelf. This was the catalyst. 1 week later, a British bomber raid targeted the rail yards at Lille. It was a disaster. The intelligence was old. The train carrying vital engine components, the raid's primary target, had passed through 12 hours earlier. The bombers hit empty sidings and were torn to pieces by the flak batteries. Adrienne checked her logbook. The train they were looking for had passed her house at 4 in the afternoon the previous day. She had the information, the vital, life-saving piece of the puzzle, but it was sitting uselessly in a child's exercise book in a butcher shop. The system was not just dismissive, it was too slow. The chain of couriers, the clandestine meetings, the risky, high-powered radio transmissions that could bring the Gestapo's direction-finding vans in minutes, it was all too cumbersome for the intelligence she was gathering. Her information was perishable. The location of a U-boat component was only valuable for a few hours. The departure of a finished U-boat for its sea trials was a secret with a lifespan of a single day. She knew she needed a new system, a way to record the vast amounts of data she was collecting, and a way to transport it that was both swift and invisible. The answer was already in her hands. It was in the rhythmic, meditative click of her knitting needles. She was breaking the rules of a game she had never officially been invited to play. She stopped attending the butcher's meetings. She began her own, deeply unauthorized, one-woman intelligence operation. Her new tactic was an act of quiet genius. She devised a code, a simple, elegant language of stitches. It was a binary system, translated into the tactile reality of yarn. A knit stitch was a 1. A purl stitch, its textural opposite, was a 0. With these two simple stitches, she could record anything. A sequence of stitches could represent a number, a letter, a date, or a pre-agreed symbol for a specific type of cargo. It was more than just a code. It was a method of data compression. She did not need to write everything down. She created a key, a legend she committed to memory with the same discipline she had once used to memorize poetry. A dropped stitch, a small, deliberate imperfection in the fabric, was a marker, signifying the start of a new dataset, a new train. A yarn over, a stitch that creates a small hole, could mean a torpedo. A change in the color of the yarn was the most significant signal of all. A shift from green to gray yarn could mean a specific Type 7 U-boat had left the yards and was heading for the sea. The length of that gray section of knitting would indicate the date. 10 rows of gray meant it had departed on the 10th of the month. The finished product was a masterpiece of clandestine art. A child's jumper, a thick winter scarf, a pair of socks. To the casual eye, they were simple, rustic garments, perhaps a little clumsy in their patterning. To the initiated, they were dense, detailed intelligence reports. A single scarf could contain the entire logistical schedule of the Lorient U-boat pens for a week. It could be worn in public, folded in a market basket, or mailed in a parcel. It was a secret that could hide in the cold light of day. This was her unauthorized test. It was a gamble on the slowness and arrogance of her enemy. The Germans searched for radios, for hidden papers, for weapons. They did not search for knitting. The moment of truth came in the winter of 1942. The local priest, a man she trusted, was arranging for a small group of children to be evacuated to what was hoped would be the relative safety of a convent in non-occupied France. Among them was a 10-year-old boy named Jean, the son of a neighbor. Adrienne spent a week knitting him a long, thick woolen scarf. It was a garish thing of mismatched colors, the kind of clumsy, loving gift an old woman might make. The border was a complex pattern of seemingly random holes and bumps. Embedded in that scarf was the complete transit schedule for 3 newly commissioned U-boats she had observed being moved in sections to the coast over the preceding month. She had noted the hull numbers painted on the conning towers as they passed: U-257, U-615, U-402. The scarf's pattern detailed their final assembly, the arrival of their torpedoes, and, from the reports of a railwayman she had cultivated as a source, their departure dates for sea trials. The boy, Jean, knew nothing. He was just a child, happy to have a warm scarf for his journey. He wore it wrapped twice around his neck as he boarded the train. He passed through 2 German checkpoints. At one, a soldier, a young man who was perhaps reminded of his own grandmother, smiled and adjusted the scarf for the boy, tucking the end into his coat. The secret, the death warrant for 3 submarines and over 150 German sailors, was literally under his hand, and he felt nothing but wool. The scarf reached the convent. A nun, another link in a chain Adrienne had painstakingly assembled, unraveled the first few inches of the border. The coded message was transcribed onto a piece of paper, reduced to a string of numbers, and passed to a contact from a British-run intelligence circuit. From there, it made its way by courier to neutral Spain, and then by diplomatic bag to London. In the Admiralty's submarine tracking room, the message arrived as a flimsy sheet of paper, a raw piece of human intelligence from an unverified source in Belgium. It was a whisper, a rumor. But the men in the tracking room were drowning. They were losing the war. They would cling to any piece of driftwood. The information was pinned to the map board. The 3 U-boat numbers were circled in red. They were ghosts, known to exist from shipyard reports, but their operational status was a mystery. Adrienne's knitting stated they were now at sea. For days, nothing happened. The pins remained on the board, a question mark in the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic map. The mole hunt continued. The institutional machinery ground on. Then came the report. A Coastal Command B-24 Liberator on a routine anti-submarine patrol 100 miles north of the Azores had made a radar contact. It had dropped out of the low clouds to find a U-boat on the surface, charging its batteries. The attack was swift, a textbook delivery of depth charges that bracketed the submarine, broke its back, and sent it to the bottom in less than a minute. The U-boat was U-615. It was a single kill, a small victory in a losing war. But for the analysts in the submarine tracking room, it was a thunderclap. The kill had happened in a sector of the Atlantic they had considered empty. But it was exactly where a new U-boat on its first patrol, following a standard transit route from the Bay of Biscay, would have been. The knitting was right. 2 weeks later, U-402 was caught and sunk by a British B-17 bomber. 10 days after that, U-257 was hunted down and destroyed by a Royal Navy frigate. The pattern was no longer a coincidence. It was proof. The "it works" moment was not a single event, but 3 cold, hard facts plotted on a map. An old woman's knitting, passed on by a 10-year-old boy, had reached across 1,000 miles of occupied territory and open ocean, and had guided the bombers to their prey with lethal, uncanny precision. The system had found its weapon. It was not a new technology. It was not a brilliant codebreaker. It was a Belgian headmistress with a ball of yarn, a pair of needles, and a clear view of a railway line. The whisper had become a roar. The unlikely hero had drawn first blood. The arrival of the knitting was not a singular event. It became a rhythm, a pulse of information that began to beat in time with the war itself. A parcel would arrive via Lisbon. A diplomatic pouch from Madrid would be flagged for immediate delivery to the Admiralty. Inside, nestled amongst mundane correspondence, would be a child's mitten, a tea cozy, a pair of woolen socks. Each one was a dense, textured spreadsheet of death. They were given a codename, Source Llama. It was a deliberately absurd name, a piece of bureaucratic whimsy designed to conceal the profound strangeness of the intelligence itself. In the hushed, tobacco-hazed confines of the submarine tracking room, the Llama reports became a source of both hope and intense professional friction. The system was not built for this. The system was built for the clean, verifiable data of a radio intercept, or the carefully weighed report of a trained agent. It was not designed to ingest the cryptic patterns of a Belgian woman's hobby. The fight for the soul of the Atlantic War was about to be fought not at sea, but in a basement room under the streets of London, between 2 men who represented 2 irreconcilable visions of intelligence. The advocate was Commander Roger Davies. He was not a sailor. He was a Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve officer, a man whose pre-war life had been spent in the quiet, methodical world of actuarial tables. He was a statistician, a man who saw the world as a series of probabilities and patterns. Where the career naval men saw ships and tactics, Davies saw data points. He was tall, thin, and wore spectacles that seemed to perpetually slide down his nose. He was the chief analyst in the tracking room, the man responsible for trying to predict the U-boat's movements. And for months, he had been failing. The Llama reports landed on his desk like a holy text. He did not see knitting, he saw numbers. He saw departure dates, patrol durations, return schedules. He saw a flow of logistical data so pure, so granular, it was unlike anything he had ever worked with. He began to map it, to correlate the arrival of a scarf predicting the departure of U-527 with the eventual ultra-decrypt that confirmed it was at sea, days later. He correlated a mitten detailing the shipment of new acoustic torpedoes with reports from convoy survivors describing weapons of a new and terrifying type. The knitting was not just accurate, it was predictive. It was a window into the future. It allowed Davies to see the wolf pack before it had even gathered. This placed him in direct opposition to the system's guardian. Captain Arthur Wallace was the head of Section 17M, the Royal Navy's Counterintelligence Division. He was a man of the old school, a career officer who had cut his teeth hunting spies in the Mediterranean. He was sharp, patrician, and possessed a mind that was both brilliant and rigidly conventional. He was the chief mole hunter, and the Llama reports, in his view, were not just unreliable, they were a professional insult. His skepticism was not born of foolishness, but of deep experience. His entire world was a hall of mirrors, a place of deception and counter-deception. When he looked at the Llama reports, he did not see a brave Belgian widow. He saw the guiding hand of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. The sinking of the first 3 U-boats, which to Davies was proof of the source's validity, was to Wallace the classic opening move of a German Funkspiel, a radio game. He saw it as bait. The Germans, he argued, were sacrificing 3 pawns to make the Allies trust a new, seemingly miraculous source. They were building its credibility, lulling the Admiralty into a state of dependency. And then, at a moment of their choosing, they would use Source Llama to feed them a single, critical piece of false information. They would use it to vector an entire convoy into the waiting jaws of the largest U-boat concentration ever assembled. To trust the knitting, in Wallace's view, was to willingly place the neck of the Allied war effort into a German noose. The boardroom conflict took place around the vast Mac table that dominated the tracking room. It was a room that ran on tension and caffeine, a place where the fate of 1,000 unseen men was plotted with wooden markers on a sheet of paper. Davies, his voice quiet but insistent, made his case. He had a new llama report. It was the most ambitious yet, knitted into a thick, ugly blanket for a baby's cot. It contained the departure schedules and probable patrol boxes for no less than 14 U-boats that had just sailed from the Biscay ports. It was, he argued, a complete German order of battle for the coming month. He pointed to the map, to a spot in the mid-Atlantic where a huge convoy, ONS-5, was due to pass. The llama data showed that this convoy, carrying irreplaceable supplies for the Overlord buildup, was sailing directly into an area where at least 3 separate wolf packs were scheduled to converge. He proposed a radical new tactic, not just to reroute the convoy to the north, into the icy waters off Greenland, but to use the llama data to go on the offensive. He wanted to detach the Royal Navy's new hunter-killer support groups, fast, heavily armed flotillas of frigates and destroyers, and send them to the patrol boxes detailed in the knitting. Not to escort, but to hunt. To use this intelligence to turn the tables, to ambush the ambushers. Captain Wallace stood opposite him, his face a mask of cold fury. He called the plan an act of catastrophic recklessness. He demanded to know the specific details of the source. Who was this agent? What was their access? How was their information being transmitted? He suspected a German-controlled radio operator was sending the messages, a classic vector for deception. Davies could not tell him. The delicate, almost unbelievable nature of the source was its greatest protection. If the Germans ever suspected that their entire U-boat logistics were being compromised by something as mundane as knitting, the operation would be blown. The source would be killed. All Davies could say was that the source was unconventional and that revealing its methods would compromise it irrevocably. To Wallace, this was proof of his suspicions. Unconventional was a euphemism for unverifiable. He saw Davies as a naive academic, a numbers man seduced by a pretty pattern, blind to the brutal, deceptive realities of intelligence warfare. He argued forcefully that the only safe course of action was to ignore the llama report entirely. It was a phantom, a siren song, luring them onto the rocks. The convoy should maintain its present course. To do otherwise, to commit their precious hunter-killer groups to a wild goose chase in the middle of the Atlantic, based on a source Davies refused to properly identify, was to fall for the German trap. The decision fell to the man at the head of the table, the director of the anti-U-boat division. He was an admiral, a veteran of the First World War who had seen the first U-boat menace up close. He was a man caught between his brilliant but unorthodox analyst and his experienced but rigid counterintelligence chief. He had listened to both sides, his face grim. He looked at the big board on the wall, the tally of losses for the month. The numbers were catastrophic. Wallace's mole hunt had yielded nothing. The established system was bleeding them dry. The war was being lost right here, on this map. This was the gamble. The admiral looked at Davies, then at Wallace. He was a man standing at a crossroads. One path was the path of caution, of doctrine, of orthodox procedure. It was the path that was leading, slowly but surely, to defeat. The other path was a leap into the dark, a bet on a ghost, a wager on an old woman's knitting. He took a long, slow breath, the air in the room thick with unspoken consequences. He said that Captain Wallace's concerns were noted, and they were valid. The risk of deception was real, but the risk of inaction was greater. The current rate of losses was unsustainable. They were not losing a battle of tactics. They were losing a battle of information. Davies' source, whatever it was the only new information they had. He made his damn the rules decision. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a depth charge. He told Davies his plan was approved. Reroute the convoy north. And dispatch the support groups. Give them the coordinates from the llama report. Tell them to proceed to their designated patrol areas and, he paused, to hunt and kill at will. A silence fell over the room. The junior officers at the edge of the table tried not to stare. The admiral had just bet the entire Battle of the Atlantic on a piece of knitting. He had sided with the statistician over the spy hunter. He had abandoned the rulebook and rolled the dice. Wallace stood rigid, his face pale. He gave a curt, formal nod. He had made his case and lost. Now he would carry out his orders. But his eyes, when they met Davies's across the map, were filled with a cold, unforgiving certainty. He was now convinced he was about to witness the greatest self-inflicted disaster in the history of the Royal Navy. Davies felt a tremor in his hands he struggled to control. He had won the argument. He had been given everything he asked for, and the weight of it was suddenly crushing. His patterns, his probabilities, his faith in a source he had never met were now being translated into steel, fuel, and men's lives. The orders went out, a cascade of encrypted signals from the Admiralty's radio room. Hunter-killer groups pulled away from their escort duties in the coastal waters. The Commodore of Convoy ONS-5 received a series of coded messages that turned his fleet of 90 ships north into the fog and ice of the high latitudes. In the submarine tracking room, the work went on, but the atmosphere had changed. The background hum of activity was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. They had thrown their spear into the darkness. Now, all they could do was wait to hear if it had hit its target, or if the unseen beast that awaited them was far larger and more terrible than they had ever imagined. The gamble was made. The pieces were in motion. For the next 48 hours, the only sound in the Atlantic would be the ping of Aztec sets, searching for an enemy whose location was plotted on a chart, derived from the simple binary code of a knit and a purl stitch. The ocean was a cold, empty desert. Kapitänleutnant Hunsaker cursed it from the cramped confines of U-527's control room. For 2 days, his boat, along with the 24 other U-boats of Wolfpack's Star, Fink, and Amsel, had been lying in wait. They were a net cast across the designated convoy route, a line of unseen death stretching for 100 miles. The intelligence from headquarters had been explicit, perfect, as it always was. Convoy ONS-5, 90 ships strong, would sail directly into their path at 800 hours on the third day. It was now noon on the third day. The hydrophones heard nothing but the groan of the sea and the distant song of whales. Hunsaker was a predator, and a predator denied his prey grows restless, angry. His confidence in the omniscience of high command was absolute, a pillar of his fighting faith. But that faith was now being eroded by the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the sea. The air in the submarine was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel oil, and stale cabbage, but the thickest smell of all was the odor of anticlimax. His watch officer reported the same thing for the 20th time. Nothing, Herr Callot, nothing on the surface, nothing below. This was the arrogant advance, grinding to a confused halt. The perfect system had delivered the wolves to the killing ground, but it had failed to deliver the sheep. Hunsaker made a decision that went against every instinct, against the strict doctrines of radio silence. He ordered the boat to the surface. They broke through the waves into a world of driving sleet and immense gray swells. The wind screamed. He had to know. He ordered his radio operator to send a short, coded query to headquarters. Where was the convoy? The answer, when it came an hour later, was a masterpiece of bewildered command. The convoy was not lost. It was gone. It had vanished from their intelligence picture 24 hours earlier. The wolf packs were to hold their positions and expand their search pattern. Hold their positions. Hunsaker stared at the churning sea. They were hunters, exposed on the surface in the middle of the day, in the middle of a trap that had no bait. He felt a sudden, cold prickle of unease. The ocean did not feel empty anymore. It felt like it was watching him. 200 miles to the south, the captain of the HMS Starling felt the same unease, but for different reasons. He was Commander Johnny Walker, a man whose placid, almost gentle demeanor concealed a mind of cold, predatory genius. He was the commander of the 2nd Support Group, a flotilla of 6 new-model sloops and frigates, the sharpest teeth the Royal Navy possessed. And for 36 hours, he had been following the most bizarre orders of his career. He had been sent at flank speed to a set of coordinates in the middle of nowhere, with the simple instruction to patrol a 50-mile box and engage any submarine contacts. There was no convoy to protect. There was no known U-boat activity in the area. He was a sheepdog sent to guard an empty field. His men were tense, their professional instincts screaming that this was a waste of fuel, a fool's errand. But Walker had a faith that superseded his own tactical instincts. He had faith in the quiet, bespectacled men in the Admiralty's basement, and so he patrolled. His ships swept back and forth, a line of hunters in a gray wilderness, their Estic sets pinging into the deep, their new Type 271 radar sets sweeping the surface. The new, unlikely tactic was now in action. It was a war of ghosts and whispers, fought with slide rules and yarn, now being translated into the hard reality of steel and high explosives. The knitting had drawn a treasure map, and Walker's ships were the spades, sent to dig at the spot marked X. The first contact was a ghost, A faint, intermittent echo on the radar of HMS Wildgoose. A flicker, there and gone, lost in the sea clutter. The operator almost dismissed it, but the orders were absolute: investigate every shadow. The frigate turned, accelerating, its bow slicing through the heavy waves. 10 minutes later, the Aztec operator, his ears pressed to his headset, his face a mask of concentration, stiffened. He reported a firm contact, a metallic echo, clear and sharp, where there should only be the hiss of the ocean. A submarine, moving slowly, a quarter of a mile ahead. Aboard the surfaced U-boat, the watch officer's binoculars were coated in a film of salt and sleet. He wiped them, raised them again, and his blood ran cold. Out of a squall, a ship was emerging. Not a freighter. It was low, sleek, and gray. A warship, moving fast, and it was coming right at them. The alarm bells shrieked through the submarine. Dive, dive, dive. The klaxon's frantic braying was the sound of bafflement, turning to pure animal panic. The U-boat's commander had only seconds to process the impossible. He had been found. In the middle of the Atlantic, in a storm, a British hunter-killer had materialized as if from thin air and was bearing down on him like an angel of death. He scrambled for the hatch as the deck began to tilt, the sea washing over it. It was too late. The frigate did not even slow down. Walker's ships were not fighting by the old rules. They were not there to make the U-boats run. They were there to kill them. The first depth charges were already in the air, arcing from the throwers on the frigate's deck. They were not a random barrage. They were a pattern, a cage of 300-pound explosives set to detonate at a specific depth, the depth calculated by the Aztec operator's steady hand. The underwater explosions were not sound. They were a physical concussion that hammered the U-boat's hull. The lights shattered, men were thrown from their feet, pipes burst, spraying the control room with high-pressure oil and ice-cold seawater. The perfect system was being dismantled by brute force, guided by an intelligence it could not comprehend. The second pattern of depth charges exploded even closer. The pressure hull, the fine work of German engineers, groaned, buckled, and then tore open with a sound like the shriek of a dying giant. The Atlantic, cold and black and unforgiving, rushed in to claim its prize. In the submarine tracking room, a clerk handed a slip of paper to Commander Davies. He read it, his face impassive. HMS Wildgoose reports sinking of one U-boat, position as designated in Llama Patrol Box Fink. He placed a small pin with a black flag on a map. He looked across the table at Captain Wallace, whose face was a stony mask. Then the floodgates opened. 20 minutes later, another signal, this one from HMS Wren. They had found another U-boat on the surface, its commander apparently so confident in his isolation that he had been sunbathing his laundry on the conning tower railings. The attack was swift, a barrage of 4-inch shells that tore the submarine apart before it could even begin to dive. A second black pin went onto the map. The enemy's bafflement and confusion, once confined to the control room of a single submarine, was now spreading like a virus through the entire German command structure. Donitz's headquarters in Lorient was receiving a cascade of frantic, garbled messages. U-438 reporting attack by surface forces, vanished mid-transmission. U-638 reporting contact with enemy destroyer group in Sector Star. Then, silence. U-125, one of Donitz's most experienced boats, sent a single final message. Attacked by aircraft. A carrier. How could there be a carrier? There was no carrier. The planes were from the escort carrier HMS Biter, which had been detached to support Walker's group. Another piece of the puzzle laid out by Adrian's knitting. The tactic was being proven decisively in a cauldron of fire and steel across a 200-mile front. The Llama report had not just predicted the location of a few submarines, it had pinpointed the exact assembly points for 3 entire wolf packs. Walker's group was not just sinking U-boats, they were performing a mass execution. They were moving from one black pin on Davies' map to the next, a vengeful finger tracing the patterns of a woolen blanket. The climax was not a single battle, it was a slaughter, a systematic, coldly efficient dismantling of the Kriegsmarine's most potent weapon. By the end of the first day, 5 U-boats were confirmed sunk. Wallace was no longer looking at Davies. He was staring at the map, at the impossible, undeniable cluster of black flags that had bloomed in the middle of the ocean. His theory, his carefully constructed world of deception and counter-deception, was lying in ruins. He had been looking for a grand, complex German stratagem. The truth was an old woman in a garden. By the end of the 48-hour battle, the tally was beyond anything the most optimistic analyst could have dreamed. 12 U-boats destroyed, another 5 damaged so severely they were forced to abort their patrols and limp home. The Wolfpacks Star, Fink, and Amsel had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. Convoy ONS-5, the bait that had never been, sailed north through the fog and arrived in Liverpool without the loss of a single ship. In the tracking room, the silence was no longer tense. It was odd. Davies stood before the map, which now looked like an ossuary. He was looking at the physical manifestation of his data. Each black pin was a vindication. Each one was a link in a chain that stretched from this London basement, across the sea, across France, to a small house in Belgium where a woman's fingers moved with a steady, rhythmic purpose. The knitting had not just rerouted a convoy, it had changed the entire geometry of the Atlantic War. The hunters had become the hunted, caught in a web they never saw, its strands spun from simple, unassuming wool. The unlikely weapon had delivered an impossible victory. The title was no longer a theory, it was a fact, written in fire and oil on the surface of the sea. The news of the slaughter that would become known as Schwarzer Mai, or Black May, reached the concrete bunker of the Befehlshaber der U-Boote in Lorient not as a single coherent report, but as a cascade of failing signals, of frantic, truncated messages, and then, most terrifying of all, of profound and spreading silence. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect and spiritual father of the U-boat fleet, a man whose nerve had been forged in the iron certainties of the First World War, faced the unthinkable. 12 of his best boats, his aces, his wolves, were gone. Not scattered, not damaged, vanished from the grid in the space of 48 hours, in an area of the Atlantic they should have owned completely. His command staff, men who prided themselves on their meticulous planning and technological superiority, were in a state of controlled panic. They tore through every possible explanation. The first, most horrifying possibility was that the British had finally definitively broken the four-rotor shark Enigma cipher. A team of cryptographers was put to work, searching for any flaw, any hint of compromise in their own transmissions. The second possibility was a new technology, a quantum leap in Allied capabilities. Rumors of a new shipborne centimetric radar, one that could detect the slim profile of a conning tower from miles away, were analyzed with desperate urgency. The third, and most insidious possibility, was a traitor. A man at the heart of Donitz's own command, feeding the convoy schedules and the Wolfpack assembly points directly to the British Admiralty. The paranoia that had crippled the Allied command just months before now took root in the German headquarters. Men looked at their colleagues with suspicion. Every secure telephone line, every courier was suddenly a potential vector of betrayal. The enemy's reaction was a frantic search for a complex answer to a simple truth they could never have conceived. Their after-action reports were filled with technical speculation and counterintelligence hypotheses. They were looking for a flaw in their machine, a ghost in their own system. They debated radar signatures and Enigma settings. They interrogated the crews of the few damaged boats that limped back to port, asking them about new Allied weapons, strange transmissions, uncanny aircraft behavior. The survivors could offer nothing. They spoke only of a sudden, brutal violence that had appeared out of an empty sea. Donitz, in his memoirs, would later attribute the disaster of Black May to the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies, particularly their long-range air cover. It was an explanation his mind could accept, a logical, military reason for a military defeat. The truth that the entire catastrophe had been orchestrated by an old woman with a pair of knitting needles was a reality so far beyond the scope of his imagination, so profoundly insulting to the industrial and intellectual might of his war machine, that it was not even in the universe of possibilities. They were looking for a thunderbolt from Zeus. They never thought to look for the worm in the apple. When the war finally ended, the trains that rumbled past Adrian Geckes's house changed their cargo. The flatbed wagons no longer carried the sleek, gray sections of submarine hulls. They carried prefabricated panels for rebuilding houses, sacks of cement, and steel girders. The sounds of war were replaced by the sounds of reconstruction. Adrian, who had received a quiet, unsigned letter of immense gratitude from a contact in the new Belgian government, a letter she promptly burned in her fireplace, went back to her old life. She was a headmistress again. She taught children how to read, how to write, how to add and subtract. The discipline and meticulous attention to detail that had made her such a devastating intelligence analyst were now once again focused on the proper formation of letters in a child's exercise book. Her neighbors, the people of Rooms, saw her as they had always seen her. A pillar of the community, a stern but fair woman, a little eccentric perhaps, but a fixed point in a world that had been torn from its moorings. They knew she had been part of the resistance. Everyone had been, in their own way. They assumed her contribution had been small, local, something to do with passing messages for the Butchers Group. No one ever knew that her quiet garden bench had been the single most effective anti-submarine warfare platform in the entire Allied arsenal for a critical period of the war. She tended her prize-winning roses. She sat in the afternoon sun, her fingers still a blur of motion. But the knitting she did now was for her nieces and nephews. The patterns were simple flowers and animals. There were no dropped stitches to mark the beginning of a dataset, no yarnovers to signify a torpedo. The secret language was retired. The code was locked away, not in a safe, but in the quiet, orderly memories of a woman who had seen the war as a logistical equation and had solved it with yarn. Her quiet life after the war was her greatest camouflage, the final, perfect act of hiding in plain sight. The moral of Adrian's knitting is not that the pen is mightier than the sword, or even that the knitting needle is deadlier than the torpedo. It is a story about the terminal danger of a closed mind. It is a lesson in the institutional arrogance that believes a problem can only be solved by the tools it already possesses. The German war machine was a marvel of technological and organizational genius. Its failure was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine a vulnerability that was not itself technological or organizational. Their intricate system of ciphers and signals was designed to protect them from a mirror image of themselves. It was utterly defenseless against an attack that came from outside its entire conceptual framework. The same failure almost crippled the Allies. The world of Captain Wallace, the world of orthodox intelligence, was so committed to its own doctrines, to the hunt for the conventional spy and the decipherable code, that it was nearly deaf to the whisper of a truly original idea. The system was designed to listen for radio transmissions, not for the gossip of a railwayman passed over a garden fence. It was designed to trust uniformed agents, not old women in occupied territory. The victory that turned the tide in the Atlantic was won not because of the system, but in spite of it. It was won because one analyst, Roger Davies, was desperate enough to listen to a story that sounded like a fairy tale, and one admiral was brave enough to gamble the entire war on the belief that it might be true. The knitting code worked because it was absurd. Its power was drawn from its perceived weakness, its genius from its profound and deceptive simplicity. It proved that the most effective weapon in any war is the ability to see the world as your enemy cannot. And this is the full circle. The unauthorized, unbelievable idea did not just win a battle, it changed the rules of the game. In the quiet, post-war reorganizations of Allied intelligence, the lessons of Source Llama and other unconventional operations were slowly, painstakingly absorbed. The great revelation was that the most valuable intelligence does not always come from stealing the enemy's master plan. It comes from understanding their daily routine. It comes from the meticulous, patient observation of the mundane, the things that are so commonplace they become invisible. The shipping manifests, the railway timetables, the fuel consumption rates, the factory production schedules. The war, they learned, is not just won in the battles. It is won in the logistics. The legacy of Adrian Gex is not a specific code to be taught at spy schools. It is a philosophy that champions the power of hyper-local, on-the-ground human intelligence. It is the understanding that the most valuable asset in an occupied territory is not necessarily the trained commando, but the person who has lived there for 50 years. The person who can feel a change in the rhythm of the streets, who notices a new kind of wagon on the 415 train, who can sense the subtle shifts in the pattern of life that signal a larger strategic move. The woman on the ground, the man in the factory, the farmer in the field, they often know best, because their world is made of the very details that the general's maps leave out. The world of intelligence is now a world of satellites and algorithms, of signals intercepts and data mining on a planetary scale. It is a vast technological enterprise dedicated to sifting through a universe of noise to find a single coherent signal. And yet, at its heart, the fundamental challenge remains the same as the one Adrian Gex faced in her garden. It is the challenge of finding the pattern in the chaos. It is the art of seeing the profound secret that is hiding in plain sight. The quiet headmistress with her ball of yarn did not just help sink 12 submarines. She taught the masters of war a lesson they are forever struggling to remember. That sometimes, the most powerful truths are not shouted through a radio. They are whispered, stitch by stitch.